Hello, class. I am going to take just about 5 minutes to give you kind of an overview of what you should be thinking about with your presentation for case 3. So these slides are out there on Blackboard, but I just wanted to kind of be specific on some of the things that I'll be looking for in the presentation. If you have any questions, we'll have the workday coming up, and you can kind of ask some clarifying questions at that point. But this is, for students that want to go ahead and get started and feel a little more comfortable about the presentation. Hopefully this will kind of answer some of those questions that you might have already. So let's see if I can advance these slides. All right. So the idea is that for case 3 is that you're going to pretty much do the exact same thing that you've done with case 1 and case 2 in terms of kind of analyzing the case, but now you're going to have a presentation instead of a written analysis. So there's no writing requirement for this last case. The only requirement is that whatever slides you plan on using in your presentation, that you'll print those out and hand those in on the Tuesday we start the presentations, regardless of when you're going. Some groups will go on Tuesday, some groups will go on Thursday, but everyone needs to be ready to go on Tuesday. So I'll collect all group slides that day, and then we'll be able to use those kind of as you're presenting to kind of take notes on it and stuff. But you only need to make one copy. You're not making copies for everyone in the class. All right. And so when you're thinking about your presentation, the idea is that you kind of think about the beginning, the middle, and the end. And I'm just going to identify some things that I'll be looking for in those different areas. It is important to recognize kind of what is your purpose, what is your kind of strategy for this presentation. For you guys, when we think about the strategy, we want to think about the purpose. So your purpose is to persuade, and this is a persuasive presentation. You're persuading kind of the key decision makers to go with your idea, your solution, your action plan. So it does become a persuasive presentation. During kind of as you're planning your presentation, you want to keep that in mind. You want to think about giving a reason for your audience to listen to what you have to say. All right, so you want to tailor your message to your audience. Your audience is not your classmates. Your audience is this organization, right? So those key decision makers in the organization. So really be mindful of that. Embrace that scenario. You are consultants presenting to this organization. So you don't want to say things like, we talked about this in class the other day, or, according to the case or according to the book, right? You want to, finesse it so it sounds like a business presentation, all right? So kind of think about that and understand the demands of the situation. And so thinking about the room you'll be in, I'll be posting the schedule. The presentation schedule. So some students will be in the room that we always meet in. Other groups will be meeting in different rooms. All rooms will have a projector and, the availability to have PowerPoint. But it might be good to kind of visit that location so you know where it's at and kind of what you're working with there. So those are all good suggestions. So when we think about an effective introduction, these 3 things I'll be looking for in your introduction. Something that kind of gets us our attention, sets the tone for the presentation, so you can have some fun here. Business presentations should be professional, but you can have some fun at the beginning to get our attention. Especially if you're later in the class, it might be, important. We've already listened to 4 or 5 other presentations, so to keep us listening. So kind of think about that. Give your audience a reason to listen. Why is it important that they listen to you? What's the impact in it for them, right? And so you can kind of talk about that as well. And then also establish a roadmap and agenda. So in your presentation, or in your introduction, I would expect to see those 3 things, and we'll be looking for that in everyone's introductions. When we think about the actual pattern that you'll use throughout your presentation, it's pretty self-explanatory. There's not a lot of flexibility, I guess, in the pattern. You're going to have an introduction. When you get into the content of your presentation, you're going to follow kind of the same pattern that you used in your analysis. So you're going to identify the problem, explain why you think the fundamental problem is what it is, provide that support, and then you'll move into possible solutions, your recommended solution, and then your action plan, and then have kind of some type of closing at that point. So that's really the pattern. There's not a lot of leeway there. You can see on the slide that there's just examples of different patterns that you can use in different presentations. So you want to think about that before our presentation. You want to follow that same pattern that you've been using within your case analysis. The sandwiching approach is something that I like to bring up because it is an option when you're talking about your solutions or talking maybe about your recommended solution, to use this pattern. This is a very kind of persuasive approach. So the sandwiching approach is to say, talk about the advantage of a solution or of your recommended solution, but then also talk about some of the concerns, some of the risks involved. This really shows that you've done your homework. You recognize that this isn't a perfect situation or a perfect solution. And then talk about, right, because we recognize these concerns, here's some things that we can do to maybe prevent them or minimize them from happening, right? And then go back and reinforce kind of the key benefits, right? That's a very persuasive approach. It earns you some credibility as a presenter that you've done your homework. And so that's part of kind of gaining some of that power in order to influence your audience. So I really encourage somewhere in your presentation, whether it's when you're talking about your just options of solutions, or if you just kind of use it during kind of your recommended solution section, I would encourage that and be pleased to hear that in your presentation. And then the end of your as you kind of transition in your presentation, you want to kind of think about how that's going to flow. So with a group presentation, you all have to present, but it doesn't all have to be equal parts. So I do encourage everyone to kind of push themselves a little bit and to take on larger parts of the presentation, but you guys as a group can determine how that's going to go. But make sure that you're transitioning well. So make sure you know who follows you in the presentation so you can introduce them appropriately and not just stop your part and then the next person starts. All right, make sure there's some flow there in between each presenter, or think about your transitions if you're presenting one topic to the next topic. Be really mindful of that. This is the only time that this audience is going to hear this presentation, so you really want to kind of lead them through it. And then the last thing is concluding on a high note, having some type of conclusion, and not just ending with your action plan, but kind of wrapping it all up after that. All right, and so to kind of end on kind of a positive note, depending on how you started the presentation, if you started with a quote or a question or a statistic, see if you can kind of weave that back into your conclusion somehow. And so those are things that I will be looking for as you kind of go through your presentation. When you are providing your support for your presentation, I'll be looking for examples from your case or from the research that you've done. I'll be looking for maybe outside support, examples of other organizations, or some concepts that might support what you're talking about. Those are things that I do want to hear. So make sure that you are referring to those and putting them into your presentation still. Again, consider your listeners. So kind of recognize what they already know. So again, your audience is essentially the organization. So giving them a ton of background and detail on who they are is probably not necessary. If you do start with a brief background, that's fine. But just make sure it's pretty minimal. And the purpose of that is just really saying, hey, look, we know your history, or we know about your company, right? So again, to establish some credibility for yourselves, but the amount of detail isn't necessary because, again, your audience is already familiar with the organization. And also recognize that you're talking to the organization, and so you don't want to badmouth them, badmouth the employees, or, you really want to make sure that you have a positive tone as you talk to the organization. And then you are required to use visual aids. So you will need to have a Prezi or PowerPoint, or if there's something else new out there that you want to use, I'm definitely open to those things, but you do have to have visual aids with your presentation. Okay, and so making sure that they're clean, they're professional, they're consistent, they're proofread, and that you practice with the visual aid. All right, which kind of gets us into the next part of kind of this, the 5 S's, I guess, is your style. And so you want to, have all these things that I talk about, but now you get to kind of put your style on them as well. And so in order to make sure that your style does shine, you need to practice to kind of help with some of those nerves, to help with that flow, with those transitions. It should look seamless to your audience. So all the little kinks of who's going to stand where, who's going to advance the slides, are we going to pass the clicker, all those things should be worked out prior to the presentation. As an audience, we shouldn't see that discussion happen. It should already be established. Making sure that you think about your eye contact, your body movement. And so I would encourage, as a group, not to all just stand together behind the podium. Maybe just the person speaking should come out and command the room, while the others kind of stand off to the side and kind of switch. Just there's several things that can work there, but you just need to make sure that you think about it and practice it. When the first bullet point says prepare your notes, you will not be allowed to use notes during the presentation. So you'll have the slides that will help guide you to talk about whatever you want to talk about, but you cannot bring any notes up there with you. So make sure you can prepare notes to kind of get you prepared for the presentation, but you won't be able to use them on the day of the presentation. And then the last slide talks about responding to questions. So you will not get any questions during, well, I shouldn't say that. You most likely will not get any questions during the first round of the presentations because we are crunched for time to get through all of them. So that won't be, if you do get questions, you want to think about to respond kind of in this way. So when you get a question, if you make it to the second round, and definitely in the third round, you'll get questions from the audience or from the judges. You want to first restate the question to make sure that everyone heard the question, to make sure that you understood the correct question correctly, and restating the question kind of gives you some time to kind of think about the answer, right? And then 2, 3, and 4 are pretty much saying, then you answer the question, right? So you state your answer. Maybe you can pull in some support from the presentation. Those are all important things that you'd want to do during that question session. All right, and also kind of think about sharing the questions and, as an individual and team, not just dominating that part, but make sure that you're not talking over one another. All those things become really important during that part of the presentation, because you're still in control of the situation, and so you still need to maintain control during that Q&A session. So again, you want to answer your questions concisely and making sure that you are actually answering the question. You want, if it gets heated, which most likely will not get heated in this situation. But in other cases, make sure that you're staying professional, no name calling during this point. It looks really bad if that happens. So if it does get heated, maybe asking the person to, let's talk about this afterwards, so we can kind of be more one-on-one. If you get kind of trapped into a dialogue, then you start losing the rest of your audience. And so, not trying to ignore the person, but asking, let's take this outside afterwards, or, let's talk a little bit later. And then kind of bring the rest of the group back into it. All right, and then it is the last bullet point just talks to the fact that it's okay to not know an answer. That's usually why we don't like the Q&A session, because what if they ask us something that we don't know? You should be knowledgeable about what you're talking about, but sometimes they're just going to ask a good question and you didn't really think about that. So it's okay to say, that's a good question. I'm not sure, on that one. So let me look into it and I'll get back with you. So that's kind of the acceptable way to answer that. But the most important part then is to actually get back with them. All right. And so that's what's going to impress them, that you took the time to look it up, and whether you call them, email them, whatever it might be, to get back with them with the answer that you found. All right. So hopefully that's helpful to give you an idea of what the expectations are for the presentation that's coming up. And if you have any questions, you'll have some time on the workday to ask, or you can send me an email to discuss anything further. Thank you, guys.